Good afternoon, Trump's family. Welcome back to my channel. Have a good day and God bless you. Let's get into the news. 73% of registered voters believe Hunter Biden did something wrong. A new poll published on Sunday showed that 73% of registered voters believe Hunter Biden did something illegal or unethical in his business dealings in Ukraine and China. The poll conducted just last week showed that 37% believe that Biden did something illegal, while 36% believe he did something unethical. 18% believe he did not do anything wrong, while 9% said they did not know if he did anything illegal, unethical or wrong. Of those polled, 43% are Democrats, 42% were Republican and 15% were independent. The latest poll shows an increase of those who believe Biden did something unethical or illegal, because in late December, the same poll had a figure of 70%. Republicans on the House Oversight Committee are investigating the Biden's family domestic and international business dealings to determine whether they compromise U.S. national security and Joe Biden's ability to lead with impartial filters, according to the committee's website. Republicans seek testimony from Biden official over exploited migrants minors working in the U.S. House Judiciary Committee. Republicans requested on Monday that the director at the Office of Refugee Resettlement appear for questioning on migrant children and teenagers working in dangerous jobs across the country. The request, made in a letter to Director Robin Marcos, comes after the New York Times published an expose about the shadow workforce of migrant children and teens working behind the scenes to process products used by popular companies including Ben & Jerry's J. Crew, Cheerios and Ford Motor Company, potentially in violation of US child labor laws. Committee Chair Representative Jim Jordan and two of the committee's top immigration hawks, Representatives Andy Biggs and Tom McClintock, authored the letter. Quote, "Our oversight includes an examination of the troubling actions by the federal government to diminish safeguards for unaccompanied alien children during the worst illegal immigration crisis in our nation's history." The Republicans wrote, "Typically, officials within the Department of Homeland Security first encounter the minors at the border and then transfer them to the Health and Human Services Department (HHS), which houses the Office of Refugee Resettlement." The Republicans cited in their letter an alarming change at DHS and HHS that they said has enabled the exploitation of minors in the ways laid out in the Times report. The change occurred in 2021 Memorandum of Agreement between DHS and HHS, which removed the requirements that HHS must provide, quote, "biographic and biometric data for all adult members of a sponsor's household in order to check the FBI, national and statewide criminal history, child abuse and neglect and other databases prior to placement of the UAC." With that sponsor, the change coincides with HHS staff telling the Times that HHS Secretary Javier Becerra has been urging his employees to rush children and teenagers through HHS and onto an adult sponsor, perhaps to manage the department's capacity in the midst of migrants continuing to flood across the border. Quote, "If Henry Ford had seen this in his plants, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line," Becerra said in a leaked video. The Republicans wrote, quote, "The failure of this administration to adequately screen sponsors of UACS and monitor them after placement has resulted in UAC as being exploited and working in extremely dangerous jobs. Children are legally prohibited from doing." They requested Marcos contact the committee to set up a transcribed interview within the next 2 weeks. Iowa and Ohio consider in-state ban on federal gun control enforcement. Iowa, Ohio, Georgia and other red states are considering in-state bans on the enforcement of federal gun controls deemed infringements on gun rights. Montana currently has such a ban, and on February 10, the governor told the ATF their AR pistol stabilizer brace rule cannot be enforced in Montana. Missouri also has such a ban, as does Nebraska and Arizona. Now, Iowa, Georgia and Ohio, along with other red states, are weighing on bans on federal gun control enforcement. Iowa State Representative Jeff Shipley is pushing the ban in his states. And the push is supported by Mike Carroll. County Attorney John Worden said, quote, "I don't see this as a liberal or conservative issue. I see it as a states' rights issue." Locals news outlets observed that Iowans voted to adopt a constitutional amendment on November 8 of last year, and the amendment exceeds the gun rights protections contained in the Second Amendment. The amendment says, quote, "The rights of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." The sovereign state of Iowa affirms and recognizes this right to be a fundamental individual right. Any and all restrictions of this right shall be subject to scrutiny. Janet Yellen makes surprise visit to Kyiv to announce another $1.25 billion in aid to Ukraine. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen slipped into Kyiv on Monday on a surprise visit to reaffirm a support for Ukraine and its struggle against Russia's invasion. Yellen met with President Volodymyr Zelensky and other key government officials just days into the second year of the war. She repeated assurances delivered by Joe Biden a week ago in the country. Quote, "America will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes," said Yellen at the cabinet minister's office. The prime minister, speaking through an interpreter, said the two discussed further U.S. sanctions on Russia aimed at weakening its economy and military and, quote, "confiscating frozen Russian assets and putting them to the benefit of the recovery of Ukraine." However, Yellen told reporters in a phone briefing that there were still significant legal obstacles to fully seizing the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets frozen by the sanctions. Yellen also announced the transfer of the first $1.25 billion from the latest $9.9 billion check of economic and budget assistance from Washington. Whistleblower says he gave the DOJ damning information on Biden family foreign business deals, and is really think tank executive who served alongside Hunter Biden as an advisor to a Chinese energy conglomerate, widely suspected of serving as a front for the Chinese Communist Party, now says he provided the FBI with damning information about the Biden's family foreign business dealings. Gao Loved, the co-director of the Washington-based Institute for the Analysis of Global Security, says he provided information about Hunter Biden, his father, his uncle, Jim Biden, to the Justice Department in March 2019. LWF served as an advisor to CEFC China Energy, a conglomerate, quote, that aligned itself so closely with the Chinese government that it was often hard to distinguish between the two. According to reports, the group, which donated at least $350,000 to Lu's think tank, paid Hunter Biden at least $6 million in 2017 to procure energy investment deals in the United States. Lu's claims come as a former Hunter Biden business partner, Eric Sharon, has started cooperating with the House Oversight Committee investigation of the Biden family's foreign business dealings. Investigations have focused heavily on Hunter Biden's work with CFC China Energy, and the Justice Department has investigated Hunter Biden since 2018 over his taxes and foreign business dealings, though the case appears to be focused on the first son's unpaid taxes. Lu's threat to, quote, name names comes after his arrest in Cyprus on February 16, on charges that he illegally sold weapons to Libya and China. Luke asserts that the United States is seeking his extradition as part of a politically motivated payback for his exposure of the Bidens, quote, "The DOJ is trying to bury me to protect Joe Jim and Hunter Biden," Luke said. An Israeli lawyer for Luke claims his client provided information about Hunter Biden to the FBI years ago. While Luke's claims might otherwise be easily dismissed as a bluff, its connection to CFC China Energy suggests he may know something about the Bidens, and an American lawyer for Loved has signaled he will provide information to Congress about Lu's case, quote, "Dr. Loved is a whistleblower." His attorney said he asserts that prosecutors decided against pursuing Lu's information and are, quote, instead targeting him with trumped-up and false charges. The attorney did not further elaborate on the information Loved has on Biden. However, the lawyer recently told the Justice Department he plans to submit a letter to Congress that will detail statements that lift-gauge the Justice Department during an interview in Belgium, according to documents. And some significant news, all right. So I want to jump in it. From my view, it seems that Ukraine has become the 51st state of the United States. We're essentially funding their government, we're keeping their people afloat using U.S. taxpayer money. However, Americans and especially Europeans are tiring of this war quickly. Yet some NATO nations, including the United States, seem to want this war to drag out. Will NATO only back off when Ukraine is destroyed? Or when Vladimir Putin dies? Or is taken out by his own regime? What are your thoughts on this situation? Okay, folks, the first question is a valid one. How long do we wait before we finally give up on trying to turn Ukraine into a permanent and existential threat to Russia? Because that's really what this is all about. We invested very heavily in Ukraine starting in 2014, to build this Ukrainian army that by the time the Russians intervene, was about 600,000. That was a little over 400,000 regular troops with over 200,000 reserves. And it was aimed exclusively at the destruction of Russia, first to attack the so-called breakaway provinces. Donetsk and Luhansk were in the east, and then to go on and reconquer, if you will, Crimea, which historically was never part of Ukraine, or remotely Ukrainian. What was Russian, certainly since 1776. So at any rate, I think, to answer the first question is it is unclear. We know that Washington, London, Paris and Berlin have essentially sworn to stay the course. That picture, as you point out, is weakening very rapidly in Germany, where it was never popular to begin with. It's also faltering in France. London seems to stick with it. Although I'm beginning to see some evidence of the truth getting through the British media, to the British public, not much. But some. The other country that seems unalterably opposed to ending this is Norway. I've still not figured out why the Norwegians are so bent on the destruction of Russia. But apparently they've signed on for this. The problem with all of it, of course, is that there was never any strategy, coherent strategy with a specific strategic end state that was attainable. We making the sweeping statements, we won't quit until Putin is removed from power or dead. We won't stop until Russia is defeated. In Ukraine. These are ridiculous statements that have no basis, in fact, have no possibility of occurring. So that puts you in the uncomfortable position when you've made these ridiculous statements publicly, to where you cannot retreat from them. And so London, Paris, Berlin, Washington are having enormous difficulty figuring out how do I retreat from these outrageous demands, and still look reasonably intelligent and competent? Well, the answer is you can't, without admitting that you were wrong. And this is the biggest problem of all. Russia was not isolated, could never be isolated. Russia's economy is doing extremely well, it would do better without the war, but it's still doing very well. It has no shortage of trade partners, and much of what Russia provides to Europe is still finding its way to Europe, through clandestine and illegal means offered by other countries that are willing to provide the middleman. The whole thing is a travesty. The Russians, who initially went in exclusively for the purpose of reaching some sort of agreement with the West about eastern Ukraine, about the breakaway republics, discovered that we weren't interested in a saluted, we were interested in destroying them. And so they have now mobilized, they build this enormous force. They're poised to attack. The Ukrainians are falling apart. The question is, what are we going to do? And I think we're not going to do anything until the Russians are probably just across the river from Kyiv in great numbers, prepared to cross in the upper river and go west. I wish it weren't so, but I think that's where we are. The rest of us are going to have to make it up unambiguously clear that our outrageous demands make no sense. And at that point, there's a real chance that the Europeans will diverge from us. Because Europe is really being hurt by this world. Everybody in the West has been hurt. But the Europeans, most of all their economies, their populations have no interest whatsoever in going to war with Russia. If you look at the polling data, they're overwhelmingly for a negotiated settlement. So the bottom line is, how long does this last? It lasts until the Europeans really can't stand it anymore. And we begin to see some European governments fall. We've already seen things change in Italy. Mr. Macron's supposition is not that strong. But the real weak link at this point is Berlin. And one wonders how much longer Mr. Schulz can hold on to his job. We have 50,000 protesters in Berlin over the weekend against the war that somebody said, well, there were still 10,000 that came out to support the war. Well, I think that's a good demonstration of just where we are. So once Berlin falters, and I think it will, because the German people just don't buy it any longer, then the world will change. And when Berlin decides to diverge, other European states will fall in line. And everyone will say enough is enough, we got to come to an arrangement. All wars in Europe, at least for the last 500 to 1,000 years, had been settled with some sort of territorial adjustment, exchange of land, and so forth. So that's what's got to happen. But again, neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And that's a good question. Right now, we don't know what will remain of it. Because more than 10 million Ukrainians have left, there were already 2 million working in the EU before the 10 million left the country. All the Ukrainians that are being interviewed, as they came out of Ukraine, have all said, we will never go back. Now we add the numbers of casualties, which are horrific. And there are any number of different interpretations of numbers, but the numbers on the Ukrainian side are very large, maybe as many as 200,000 dead by now and other 300,000-400,000 wounded. Most of these are people that will not recover from their wounds, they will be permanently disabled. So this has got to come to an end. I don't think there's much disagreement about it. That's what I got for you, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. If you're up for it, I'm gonna get back to work. Thanks for watching.